European leaders say the coming week could be decisive for Europe. Talks between the United States and Ukraine on a possible peace plan are intensifying, and that plan would later be presented to Moscow. But the Kremlin is already signaling rejection. Russia say it will not accept parts of the deal. It opposes security guarantees Ukraine is asking for in exchange for stepping back from NATO, and it rejects the idea of a buffer or demilitarized zone where Russian troops would pull back from the front line. So what really matters right now for Ukraine, for Europe, and for global security? Joining me now is David Tafuri, foreign policy analyst and lawyer. David, it's my pleasure to have you here online.
Thanks for having me again.
So David, American officials held hours of talks with President Zelensky in Berlin. And the US wants a peace deal by the end of the year, but major differences remain, especially over Donbass. Can negotiations realistically move forward without a clear agreement on territory?
Yes, I also spoke this weekend with a high-level Trump administration official, and that person made clear that the Trump administration expects and wants a peace deal in the next few weeks. So I think they're aiming to try to get it concluded before the end of the calendar year. But as you mentioned, there still remain significant differences between the Ukrainian position and the Russian position. And notably, Russia has not made any compromises that I am aware of yet. And when I had discussions with this administration official, that administration official also couldn't explain what the Russian compromise was. And so Ukraine, for now, should be holding strong to the position that it's not going to give up territory that it currently occupies. I know the Trump administration feels a little bit differently. It would like for Ukraine to give up all of Donbass, but that is a fairly controversial and odd position for the United States to take. In a country that has fought and successfully defended territory rarely gives up that territory. Now, the Trump administration, as you've heard from some public reports, believes that Ukraine is losing, but the statistics don't really bear that out because Russia is losing far more troops and far more military equipment in order to take very minimal amount of territory over time. And so the Ukrainians and President Zelensky are right to maintain a strong position and not make too many compromises, even if that means there cannot be a deal, because in the end, it's Russia that is the recalcitrant party. And we know that because Putin has not made any compromises.
Yeah, from what I've heard at the conference of President Zelensky last week, I visited it, and he said that Russia is kind of agree on 800,000 soldiers of Ukrainian troops, or that's the limit. That was not the case in 2022, and now it's okay. And also regarding the Russian language and religion, but I mean, it's not that big issue that you are talking about, definitely. So, David, based on what we know so far, still, how big are the differences between Washington and Kyiv? Are there just a tactical disagreement or something more?
Well, first of all, I would say that not all of Washington is in agreement. Keep in mind that there are Democrats and Republicans who feel very strongly that in order for there to be a successful peace agreement with Russia, Russia cannot be seen to be winning and cannot be benefiting as a result of its illegal invasion of Ukraine. And that's particularly a strongly held view and a bipartisan view in the US Congress. And even within the Trump administration, there is some disagreement, especially there are people at the Pentagon and in the State Department who are against Ukraine capitulating to Russia. On the other side, you have high-level Trump administration officials, as represented by Witkoff and by Jared Kushner, who are pushing very hard for a peace deal and are willing to make compromises and try to pressure Ukraine into making compromises in order to achieve that deal. So it's very goal-oriented, with the goal being a peace agreement at any cost.
And President Zelensky reportedly offered to step back from NATO ambitions, you know that, in exchange for strong security guarantees. In real terms, what could those guarantees look like without NATO membership? Because, David, you know, we as Ukrainians know that sometimes, you know, security guarantees are pointless and mean nothing.
Yes, absolutely. Keep in mind that the Trump administration and President Trump, when he was a candidate to be president, said many times that the US would not give a security guarantee to Ukraine. So even the fact that there's a discussion about a security guarantee from the United States to Ukraine is progress in a positive way for Ukraine. Now, President Zelensky, as you mentioned, has said he might be willing to give up the goal of becoming part of NATO in the near term and getting that Article 5 security guarantee. That's the gold standard because that means every country in NATO has an obligation to defend every other country. So if Ukraine is part of NATO, it benefits from that Article 5 security guarantee. But it is possible for some countries like the US, UK, and France, which have all at times suggested they might give a security guarantee, to give a separate security guarantee that is not linked to the Article 5 guarantee, and for that security guarantee to be meaningful, because the United States does not want to be seen as breaking promises and agreements that it makes with foreign countries, because then other foreign countries would be unwilling to trust the United States. So a security guarantee from the US is something. It's not as strong as an Article 5 security guarantee that comes with joining NATO.
And also, you know that the American president not only once was stressing that he wants the election in Ukraine, and President Zelensky has asked lawmakers to draft a bill that could allow elections during martial law. How much could this discussion be shaped by outside political pressure, including from the United States?
Well, first of all, let me say that I understand the US position generally that we should encourage elections across the countries that are democracies in the world. And when they delay elections, we should have concern. But the reason elections were delayed in Ukraine has good underlying basis, because they were delayed because there was a view, and there still is a view, that it would be very hard to hold national elections in a fair, secure way while fighting with Russia, and that having elections gives Russia the opportunity to interfere in the election in Ukraine, to mount misinformation and disinformation campaigns, to unfairly influence the campaign. And we don't want that. And we know Russia will do that because Russia has done that across the world. Even here in the United States, it's attempted to interfere in our elections. So while it's overall generally a positive for the US to encourage elections, in this case, it's really different. And I would also note, I don't understand why President Trump would be so would think it's so important to have elections in Ukraine when Russia, the other party to this conflict, never has free and fair elections. That it doesn't. Russia is not a democracy. It doesn't allow opponents who have a chance of defeating Putin to run for office. So why isn't President Trump, at the same time that he's voicing his desire for Ukraine to have elections, criticizing Russia for never having free and fair elections, for depriving its people of the right to self-determination to choose who are going to be their leaders?
From where these narratives are coming from, how do you think?
From Putin, from the Kremlin, from pro-Russians who are looking for excuses to criticize Ukraine. And it's just the height of hypocrisy for anyone in Russia who supports the Kremlin and supports Putin to be talking about having elections in Ukraine. Russia is the place that is very far from a democracy, that needs to have free and fair elections, that needs to have institutions and NGOs and civil society to have a greater say in how Russia is governed. And Russia has restricted all of that. So for Russia, a non-democracy, an autocracy, a kleptocracy, to be criticizing any other democracy around the world like Ukraine is pure hypocrisy.
But other than Russia, David, what are the risks if elections are held mainly to satisfy international partners rather than Ukraine's internal security and wartime realities?
I think it's a huge risk. And it gives Russia a significant opportunity to try to change the dynamic and the narrative in Ukraine. That's why Putin wants it. He knows that election could cause Ukraine to be less unified, at least for the period of the election. And Ukraine's unity is its strongest asset when confronting this illegal invasion by Russia.
And even just going back to the negotiation process, even ahead of the Berlin talks, the Kremlin made clear it will not accept changes to its peace plan. What does this tell us about Russia's real intentions at this stage, today?
To me, it tells us that the Kremlin is not ready to really have a peace agreement, that they want peace only on their terms with the exact same conditions, essentially, that Putin has been demanding since even before he invaded Ukraine. And many of those demands just don't make sense from a Ukrainian perspective. Ukraine should not have to give up territory that it has bravely fought to defend. And Russia should not get territory that it has not even been able to acquire on the battlefield. I would also note that any deal that freezes the border along the current front lines has to make clear that that doesn't mean that's going to be the permanent border. What it is doing is it is a cessation of hostilities and a decision to honor that border, but it's not a permanent border. The border needs to be decided by the people of both countries and the people that live in those areas.
Yes, and if Moscow rejects compromise outright, David, what leverage do the United States and Europe actually have left?
Well, the U.S. and Europe have a lot of leverage. The U.S. and Europe recently ratcheted up sanctions some more by putting two Russian state-owned oil and gas companies on the sanctions list. That is going to cause Russia to lose more revenues. But there's a lot more that can be done, especially targeting the shadow fleet that allows Russia to sell its oil and gas around the world, and also to put more sanctions and more enforcement on Russian banks and financial institutions. These would help squeeze the Russian economy, which is an important part of what needs to be done to put even more pressure on Putin to get him to make reasonable compromises. Of course, on the military side, we also have leverage. There are still weapon systems that we have not yet provided, like the Tomahawk missile system, that if we were to provide it, it would also give Ukraine an additional advantage on the battlefield. And notably, the US and the European countries have much bigger economies, especially when you combine them, than Russia. So if the US and Europe really want to provide Ukraine with the resources it needs to defeat Russia on the battlefield, they have the capacity to do that.
Have you heard that Russia already sued Euroclear company for this 230 billion euros, the frozen assets, to give it back? And the European Union said that you will not get back this money, not today, not tomorrow, not in a long-term perspective.
I applaud the European response, and the European response needs to be guided by the law. But Europe has the right to freeze and sanction assets, as they have done with respect to the Russian central bank assets that are at issue. And the law has been changed here in the United States to make it easier to actually confiscate those assets in order to support Ukraine. And the US and Europe should continue to look at how to use those assets in order to support Ukraine and to be coercive towards Russia, so Russia sees it losing its money and that money going to support Ukraine. You could do it in stages so that you could take $1 billion every week and give it to Ukraine, and Russia would watch its money slowly be dissipated and used to support Ukraine.
So you think that that decision of the Brussels is unreversible regarding frozen assets?
I wouldn't say it's irreversible. I think Brussels has, the authority to do what it wants on sanctions, although it has to do so in collaboration with the other EU members. And I think, this is a difficult issue, because normally when a sovereign government's assets are frozen, They are held, and the sovereign government is not able to access them, but they aren't usually confiscated. But in this case, they could be confiscated as punishment for Russia's illegal invasion. It's Russia that broke international law first. That's what gives the countries like Belgium the right to seize those assets, hold those assets. And now that the law has been changed, at least here in the US, and I believe in Europe, to make it easier to confiscate them to support Ukraine, it can be done while following the law in an orderly manner. And so the concern on the other side is that when you freeze assets and you confiscate them, then some countries might be less willing to invest in Europe and the United States. But that's a risk, in my view, that we need to take.
Absolutely. And at the same time, a Russian delegation has just arrived in Washington for a G20 SHIRP meeting under U.S. chairmanship. Does this signal a willingness by Washington to re-engage Russia in a global economy and geopolitical issues despite the war?
I'm not sure. You could interpret it that way. I don't know exactly what the Trump administration's intentions are. Perhaps they're trying to, dangle some carrots in front of Russia, so some incentives for Russia to be more reasonable at the negotiating table with Ukraine. But I do think the United States needs to be very careful about talking about business deals and commercial deals in Russia, which sometimes comes up in these negotiations. Russia is a sanctioned country. It's very hard to do any business at all in Russia if you're an American or European company because of the substantial sanctions on Russia. And we shouldn't be undercutting our own sanctions by discussing business deals with Russia, even if those are future prospective business deals. With respect to the G20, well, we know Russia was kicked out of the G8 in 2014 because of its invasion and annexation of Crimea and invasion of eastern Ukraine. And that was a consequence of Russia's illegal activity back in 2014. We shouldn't roll back that punishment on Russia until Russia does something to demonstrate that it's changing its conduct and behavior. And given the status of the negotiations with Ukraine and Kremlin's hard line on not making compromises, I don't believe that it has made a change in its conduct that would warrant its inclusion in the G7 or even the G20.
Absolutely. I think they are in Moscow are dreaming about to begin the business with the West again. Okay. So I'm just opening the Western media, and Russia's leadership is now described by Western intelligence as exporting chaos across Europe, not just conducting a regional war. Does this signal a shift in how NATO and Europe must think about Russia's threat in the long term?
To be honest, NATO and Europe should have been thinking about this years ago. I mean, we know Russia wants to interfere in elections. What Russia wants to undermine democracies. It did that in our 2016 election. I'm not saying it was successful, but Russia attempted to interfere in our election. There's overwhelming evidence to show Russia's intent on that. And it has interfered in other countries' elections, like in Romania, for instance, supporting a candidate that was pro-Russian and engaging in misinformation and disinformation in the democracies in Eastern Europe. So NATO and the EU are really way behind in recognizing the problem and doing things to counter the problem.
Yeah, and I think, David, you've heard yesterday the passionate and powerful speech of the German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, when he said in Munich that the era of the American support is over. And now the United States is care about its own interest much more than it was even a year ago. And, Germany's new 10-point defense strategy embeds Ukraine deeper into European security cooperation. Could this be the start of a new European defense identity, partially independent from U.S. policy?
It could be, and it should be. And I don't think anyone in the United States, even the Trump administration, would object to that. In fact, President Trump wants Europe to take more of an effort for its own collective defense. So I also think that the German leader is right to say that we need to do everything we can to support Ukraine and assume we might not get much more support from the United States. The Trump administration has a different view than the Biden administration. It is not going to provide the level of financial assistance that the Biden administration provided to Ukraine. And so the approach from Europe should be, we hope we'll get more support from the United States, but we cannot count on it. And I think President Zelensky and the Ukrainian government has to look at this that way as well.
And with Russia's strikes targeting Ukraine's energy infrastructure more intensively this winter, you probably heard about Odessa in recent days. Does maintaining negotiations while the physical war escalates make strategic sense, or does it risk weakening Ukraine's hand, or it's just happening and that's it?
I mean, that's just a reality of the situation. It sounds ridiculous for Russia to be increasing its attacks on Ukraine, including attacking civilians and civilian infrastructure, while it says it wants a peace deal. It's contradictory, but that's Russia. That's how Russia operates. And so it's going to continue. Russia is going to, keep mounting its terrorist campaign against Ukraine to put pressure on Ukraine. But notably, Ukrainians are strong, they're resilient, and it hasn't worked so far. And so Russia should recognize that no amount of pressure on Ukrainian civilians is going to get them to give up their freedom for Russia.
David, on that, I would say positive note, I'm saying you great thank you for your time and your brilliant answers, and I hope to see you again.
Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава!